everybody, and welcome to this Dataslate reaction video for the Chaos Space Marines. It is Tom, the very lowest of men here, reporting in on an extremely hot summer's day in the UK. And I'm going to be looking at one of the factions that I think took probably a hard hit, actually, overall in this Dataslate. An army I've been playing a fair bit recently, the Chaos Space Marines, and diving into the good, bad, and ugly for the faction coming out of these recent changes. As ever, thanks so much for your support. Please do hit like, subscribe, leave us a comment, let me know. Too far, too little, not enough? I'm curious to know what you think about the changes to Chaos Space Marines. Maybe I'm a little bit too close to it as someone who's been playing them a lot. I'd love to get your perspective. And if you want to support us, you can sign up and become a YouTube member as well. Let's dive into it. So, the Dataslate impact itself has a number of effects on Chaos Space Marines. They've adjusted it once again so that if you're playing pack-bound, your marked rhinos have to match their contents once again. Now, this obviously is a nerf because you were briefly once again able to have Nurgle rhinos with protection at range and extra exploding hits with the guys firing out the firing deck, and you could load that with Slaanesh Legionnaires or Undivided Chosen, various different options, which gave you really nice flexibility in combinations. Now, it's not a surprise that this went away. It was a combination they'd already adjusted before, so I think this isn't something anyone needs to be too sad about. But certainly as someone who was really enjoying chain cannon rhinos, I'll be sad to see it go. Another change from the Dataslate is that Warp Talons have been adjusted. Now, this is no surprise to anybody. I think this was a unit that definitely needed adjustment, so it's good to have seen it. Warp Talons now have to kill a unit to return to reserves, rather than simply just being able to do it at the end of a phase when they're not immediately in engagement range, which means that Warp Talons have to be a little bit more picky in their targets, have to play the game a little bit more carefully to actually function on the board. Then we've got some serious points hikes. So points going up on the Vindicator and the Chaos Predator. These are two tanks that we're seeing a lot of use, gaining 10 points each. So if you're running several of them, you're taking a sort of unit hit already. And that's doubled up with a points hike on Legionnaires, little points nudge on Accursed, points rise on Raptors, and points rise on Havocs. Now, two of these I fully understand. I think Legionnaires were so good at their points and we're seeing an awful lot of use. I think Accursed have a lot of potential and definitely are a unit that has been creeping into singles play and is a very powerful unit still. So I don't think it's at all unreasonable to nudge the points up on them. But Raptors and Havocs, as we'll get to, I don't think we're necessarily in the frame outside of maybe one or two builds in the first place. So I think that's a particularly harsh change. And finally, a big points hike on Warp Talons. Now, I think that's fine. I think Warp Talons are expensive. You're heading towards only taking 10 or maybe 15 at most. Actually, personally, my assessment was that lists running more than that weren't that good. And I think actually this is very manageable for Warp Talons. I think they have a very specific role now. This is not simply a go and do anything, kill anything, run away, recycle again kind of unit, and it's not one you can spam without consequences. It is expensive, and it does have pitfalls. If you want to learn about those, then watch the Counterplay Plus I put out about how to deal with Warp Talons. Just as relevant as ever, and now if you do deal with them, your opponent's losing a lot more points. So 50 points rise on a 10 brick, which is definitely expensive. So what you're seeing here is a lot of the existing Chaos Space Marine list taking 100+ point hits. And that is steep. That's very steep, especially when you compare it to some of the other factions and the adjustments they've been taking. So yeah, definitely a hard points hit for the Chaos Space Marines in the Dataslate. As far as the core rules impacts are concerned, there's a number of little tweaks here that do adjust CSM in different ways. So one of the big ones is that grenades don't work. You can't use the grenade strat when advancing or falling back. Now, Legionnaires love to do this, Chosen love to do this. So this is definitely a hit for CSM who often like to stage advance out of a rhino and then punch things. So not being able to use grenade whilst you're doing that is definitely a nerf. They still have loads of grenades dotted around the army and they'll still be able to exploit it in different ways, but this is definitely an adjustment that is a negative for them. You've got cheaper heroic intervention now being 1 CP. This is actually a very good change for CSM, especially CSM lists that go hard on primary bodying and lots of infantry and accursed, things like possessed and chosen, all sorts of things that want to jam up the board. Having a lot more intervention risk for such a combat capable army is a really powerful thing, but it also means that things like Warp Talons have to be a lot more careful because it's actually much easier for the opponent to set up traps to keep them where they are and stop them being as effective. So this is a change that I think overall is a gain for CSM, but definitely does require some adjustments on their part in how they play as well. Finally, the changes to either adding cost or reducing cost to strats is both a blessing and a curse for Chaos Space Marines. Being able to make a much wider range of stratagems cheaper via Lords actually opens up play in a lot of the other detachments, and that's really nice to see. It's nice to see cheaper options for things like Deceptors, or particularly veterans of the Long War, who have some very spicy stratagems which are now easier for them to use. I actually think this is quite nice on the Terminator Lord, who can make a brick of Terminators do a bunch of different things now for cheap, which is actually really good to see. And I think this is a good internal balancing change for CSM, where, as you know, out the gate it was Renegade Raiders that really had the good suite of battle tactics, and this actually gives you options to open up and look at a wider range of the detachments. I think the downside here for CSM is that you now can't double stack stratagems, and a lot of CSM lists were very, very big on being able to have a go turn where two lords are firing out with units and both using offensive stratagems, particularly Profane Zeal, but also some of the newer offensive stratagems in Renegade Raiders as well. So losing that massive go turn definitely does hurt CSM and does change the value of the CSM Lord as well. I think it's going to require some repurposing. I actually still think CSM are going to be able to navigate this change fine and have lots of new interesting little plays that a good player is going to be able to build into their lists, but the raw go turn power of two lords both powering up their units has been toned down a little bit, and that's probably for the best, to be honest. So let's talk through the good, the bad, and the ugly. So there are some goods. I think one of the main goods is that indirect, taking nerfs and potentially fading further out of the meta, is actually very good for CSM. Particularly Warp Talons are a unit that's incredibly vulnerable to indirect. So being able to stage those and not worry about them getting blasted before you even get to use them is definitely a positive. And the army in general does like being able to do more in the game without having to worry about indirect. It's very much a come from behind a wall to hit you in the face kind of army. So less indirect in the game is definitely a benefit. Now, as already alluded to, the stratagem changes allow you to explore a wider range of detachments. It's definitely worth revisiting, I say particularly Veterans of the Long War and Deceptors, and looking at what you open up in the game by having units with lords that are much more able to exploit free stratagems. I think there's some very real positives there. And it's also worth considering Cypher as well. As a Vect agent, Cypher can definitely offer something for CSM lists looking to get involved in melee by popping a very crucial kind of shutdown aura of your opponent's defensive strats at a key moment in the game. So they've definitely got play there. I also think that probably overall, although some of these changes are quite steep, I think the internal balance of the book comes out looking a little bit better after this. Warp Talons were obviously too good. Legionnaires were obviously too good. I think probably the Vindicator is a unit that merits its 185 points cost because it's a devastating gun tank. And I think actually it's still a consideration and a take even with its higher cost. But there's now perhaps a little bit more of a decision point to be made between sort of actually jamming multiple vehicles in and actually going wider with your assets, which combined with Pariah Nexus means that CSM units, which have brilliant output, are now less likely to be spammed en masse in general. And actually you're going to see slightly more diverse CSM lists as a result, with the possible exception of infantry jam lists involving Accursed Cultists and Possessed, which actually I still think probably have a lot of play at their current price points as something that you can take a lot of and really shove on the board. So because of that, I think it remains a really powerful primary bully army. I think it's lost some of its secondary play. And actually, if I take my CSM hat off for a moment and look at the game in a holistic sense, that is the role the Chaos Space Marines are always supposed to play. They are an army that's intended to be very powerful at dominating the primary, but is a little bit weaker at secondaries than some of the sneakier, trixier armies. And actually, there was a risk that with the width of assets that they had, that they were going to be able to be really good at both these things at once, which would simply have made them quite oppressive into certain enemy builds. I still think it's a little harsh, but actually I think, yeah, the character and role of CSM has perhaps been nudged and shaped and defined a little bit, and I think actually the internal balance comes out of this looking a bit better, both between the detachments and between the units. Let's get to the bad. So Warp Talons are expensive and harder to use well. Those who know me will know I've already been an advocate for Warp Talons not being quite as good as some have advocated for, and I think we've seen that out in the wild. Actually, lists completely spamming Warp Talons simply have not succeeded with much consistency. I think 10, 15, and occasionally 20 has been as good as it's got, and I think now they are much more likely to be taken in smaller numbers, and there is a lot more risk involved. You are definitely going to live and die as a CSM player by how well you use those Warp Talons, so you need to practice a lot and level up with them. And actually, I like that. I like that one of the jankier units in this new book now requires careful play to maximize and can very easily become a massive handicap if you simply give it away cheaply. So it's a bad thing. It's tough for the player, but actually I think probably a net positive for the game. Next up, vehicle spam lists and MSU builds both take a hit. Go wide Legionnaires is much more expensive. Go wide MSU in vehicles for Renegade Raiders is also more expensive and takes a number of different hits. Vehicle spam in pack bound takes a big hit. Now, the one that doesn't really is Soul Forged, because the demon engines have in the main stayed the same. Shout out to the Venom Crawler, who did cop a little nerf and got 10 points more expensive as well. But actually, Soul Forged exploiting other demon engines is not actually in as bad a point as some of the others. So I think that's fair, because Soul Forged is probably on the crazy and fun, but not necessarily as raw powerful as some of the others. But it will be interesting to see if people actually can build Soul Forged gunline lists that work well coming out of this. And finally, the other key part of bad is simply that meta rivals come out of this much better off, right? There's a whole number of armies that get away with much lighter touches here. Thousand Suns, Blood Angels, to name a couple, Grey Knights, to name another. And there are also a number of armies in the game which actually CSM have an interesting and finely poised game into, like Demons and Drakari, that I think both come out of this slate way stronger than them. So that's going to be an interesting thing for CSM. I think a lot of their sort of closer and tougher games are actually probably they've come out of this at a less of an advantage than their rivals going in. How much this interacts with the new missions and Pariah Nexus packs, we'll have to see. It might be that a combat army like CSM really enjoys being a bit closer to the enemy in some of the missions, and actually we're going to have to see this in totality to fully understand it. But at the raw level of points and rules, they've definitely suffered more than armies that actually arguably needed more of a hit than they did. Which takes us on to the ugly. So some of these nerfs definitely did feel unwarranted. I don't think Raptors and Havocs deserve points rises. I think you've seen Havocs in explicitly Renegade Raiders and explicitly using and souping all the combinations and buffs that detachment can give, and they're still 5 fragile marine bodies that get good output for a turn and they get murdered. Raptors are a nice scoring piece. They simply don't have much by way of output or threat. And I think the nerf there is pretty harsh as well. Felt like they'd found quite a nice price point for them at 85. I don't think the data, as we'd seen it going into this slate, really supported Chaos Space Marines taking a harder hit than other armies around them. The data was very much showing high 40s, occasionally low 50s, swinging between the two. So it's an army in a perfectly balanced spot. So taking 100 plus points hit feels harsh. But I think what I would say we're looking at here is probably a preemptive safety nerf. And actually, in this sense, I think we need to be optimistic, because I think one thing we're really seeing in 10th edition is a desire to actively prevent new meta menaces from emerging, to actively control the shifting game, so that it's not simply a case of, well, every new book just gets to roll over everyone else and we have our options heavily curtailed in what we can take and what we can play. So I think someone's looking at this with a big pragmatic strategic hat on, and is trying to make sure Chaos Space Marines don't emerge as a problem after a data slate. In that sense, I think they've probably been harsher than they need to, but we've seen this a few times with various different armies, but it also, having seen how they were treated last time, where after 3 months they got adjustments again, my guess at this stage, and I may be wrong, we'll see, Ed thinks I'm wrong, is that I think some of these adjustments will simply be adjusted back later down the line. It's going to be interesting to see how Chaos Space Marines get on. I think they're going to be one of those flat track bully armies that definitely have some good matchups, definitely feel quite oppressive in certain games, but actually struggle to close out and win events into the field that currently exists. I think they've had some success since the book came out, but actually not the level of success of a dominant army that's rolling all before it. And I don't see anything that's going to suggest that this will continue to be the case now. If there is, it's going to be something in a massed infantry jam army, I think. And I'm looking forward to seeing if recent trends towards a Cursed Cultist or potentially something like Possessed continue to play out as well. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting one for CSM players. It's always a tough one to take when your new book takes hits straight out the gate. But I think we need to get stuck into Pariah Nexus and see where the army sits after a couple of months, and then work out whether there's going to need to be sort of corrective support for the army again going forwards. But what certainly is the case, that if you're a CSM player and you enjoy exploring the wider range of options and detachments in the book, I think this has incentivized you to do that, and I think that's cool. Thank you so much for supporting us. Really enjoyable to chat about the Chaos Space Marines. I'm going to be playing them a lot over the next few months, so I'll let you know how I get on. And there'll be more Data Slate reactions to come, so keep an eye out for those. Do hit like and subscribe, leave us a comment. Let me know your thoughts. Have you been punishing yourself playing in CSM and you're relieved that this is over? Do you play the army yourself and you think maybe agree with me that it's a little bit too harsh? Let me know what you think. And remember, you can also support us by becoming a YouTube member, which helps us to keep bringing amazing content to you on a regular basis. And finally, get in our Discord. There's a thriving free Discord. We've got loads of Chaos Space Marine players in there. Get involved in the conversation and get joined in with the gang as we all start figuring out where we're going to take this army next. I'll see you again soon. Lowest of Men out. Bye-bye.